What if the person you've been grieving for years suddenly showed up at your door one night, only to tell you they're not coming back? That's exactly what happened to me. And trust me, this story will leave you questioning everything you think you know about love, loss, and letting go. But before I dive in, there's something important I need to share with you. Something that could change your life forever. If you're stuck in the 9-to-5 grind and dreaming of a way out, check the description below for a special link. It's your ticket to financial freedom and retiring early. Now, let me take you into the haunting tale of the night my grandmother returned from beyond the grave. Trust me, this isn't just another bedtime story, it's a chilling journey that'll stay with you long after it ends. If you enjoy it, and I know you will, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Let's create a community of horror lovers who crave unforgettable stories, and maybe even inspire each other to chase our dreams along the way. It was the kind of night that felt heavier than usual, the air thick, almost suffocating, like the universe itself was holding its breath. I'd been tossing and turning for hours, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. My alarm clock glowed faintly on the bedside table, its red digits blinking 3:17 a.m. Not exactly the best time to be wide awake. And then I heard it. A knock. 3 sharp raps against the front door. At first I thought I imagined it. Who would be visiting at this hour? Still groggy, I sat up in bed, straining my ears. Silence followed, stretching out endlessly. Just as I convinced myself it was nothing more than a stray branch tapping against the window, the knocking came again, louder this time, insistent. My heart began to race. Every instinct told me not to answer. But curiosity gnawed at me, gnawed until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing the baseball bat I kept propped beside my bed, a habit left over from living alone, I crept downstairs. Each step creaked beneath my feet, amplifying the tension coiling in my chest. By the time I reached the door, my palms were slick with sweat. Through the peephole I saw nothing. No shadowy figure lurking on the porch, no car parked haphazardly in the driveway. Just emptiness. Relief washed over me, for about half a second. Because then, just as I turned away, another knock echoed through the house. This one softer, almost hesitant. "Who's there?" I called out, clutching the bat tightly. No response. Only silence. Against every ounce of logic screaming inside me, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. And there she was, standing under the dim glow of the porch light, wrapped in her favorite floral shawl. My grandmother. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. It wasn't possible. She'd passed away 6 months ago. I'd stood by her grave, watched the coffin lower into the ground. Yet here she was, smiling at me with those same warm eyes I remembered so vividly. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "Can I come in?" Her voice sent chills down my spine, not because it sounded wrong, but because it sounded exactly like hers. Shaky and uncertain, I stepped aside, allowing her to enter. As she walked past me, a wave of cold air swept through the doorway, raising goosebumps on my arms. I closed the door quickly, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my thoughts. We settled into the living room, sitting across from each other on opposite ends of the couch. For a while, everything seemed normal. Too normal. She asked about work, joked about my cooking skills, or lack thereof, and reminisced about family vacations we'd taken years ago. It felt like any other visit, except there was something off about her smile. Something distant, almost sad. And then there were the little things I couldn't ignore. Like how her hands hovered slightly above the coffee table instead of resting on it. Or how her voice carried a faint echo, as though she were speaking from far away. "Grandma," I finally managed to choke out, my throat dry. "You're dead." She sighed, her expression softening. "Yes, dear. I am. But I came back because I needed to see you one last time. To make sure you're okay." Tears welled up in my eyes. "Why didn't you visit sooner?" "Why now?" "Because it's time," she replied simply. "You've been holding on too tight, keeping me alive in your memories instead of letting me go. I love you, but I can't stay." Before I could respond, the room grew colder. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. Grandma stood, her figure fading into transparency. "Goodbye, my darling. Remember me fondly, but live your life." And with that, she disappeared. Alone again, I collapsed onto the couch, clutching the blanket she used to knit, knowing I'd never feel her presence again. The days following that surreal encounter were a blur of confusion, grief, and disbelief. I couldn't shake the image of my grandmother standing in my living room, her familiar smile, her gentle voice, the way she smelled faintly of lavender. It felt so real, yet every rational part of me screamed it wasn't possible. She was gone. Dead. buried. And yet, she had been there. I spent hours replaying our conversation in my mind, dissecting every word, every gesture, searching for answers, or at least some semblance of closure. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. How could she appear like that? Was it a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or something far darker? To distract myself, I began flipping through old photo albums stored in the attic. Dust clung to the pages as I opened them, releasing memories buried under layers of time. There she was, young, vibrant, full of life. Pictures of her baking pies in the kitchen, gardening in her floppy sun hat, teaching me how to knit scarves that inevitably ended up lopsided. Each snapshot sparked a flood of emotions, both bittersweet and painful. One particular photograph caught my eye, a faded Polaroid of us sitting together at the dining table, surrounded by plates of steaming food. It was Thanksgiving, one of her favorite holidays. She always insisted on cooking everything from scratch, claiming no store-bought pie crust could ever compare to hers. As I stared at the picture, I could almost hear her laugh, see her eyes crinkle at the corners as she teased me for sneaking spoonfuls of whipped cream straight from the bowl. That's when it hit me, the recipe book. The one she'd painstakingly handwritten over decades, filled with notes scrawled in the margins, add extra cinnamon for warmth. After her death, I tucked it away in a drawer, unable to face the memories tied to it. Now, driven by an inexplicable urge, I retrieved it from its hiding place. Flipping through the pages, I found comfort in the familiar handwriting, the stains of ingredients long since baked into history. Her voice seemed to echo in my head as I read aloud recipes for apple pie, chicken pot pie, and her famous pumpkin bread. For a brief moment, it felt like she was still here, guiding me through the steps. But then came the chill. A sudden drop in temperature sent goosebumps racing across my skin. The air thickened, heavy with an unshakable presence. Slowly I turned around and froze. Standing in the doorway was my grandmother. Again. This time, however, she didn't look quite as solid as before. Her edges shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising off asphalt on a summer day. Still, her smile remained warm, inviting. "I see you found my recipes," she said, her voice carrying that same distant echo. "How are you doing this?" I demanded, clutching the book tightly against my chest. My heart pounded wildly, torn between fear and longing. "You're not supposed to be here." She tilted her head slightly, studying me with an expression that bordered on pity. "Some things defy explanation, sweetheart. All you need to know is that I'm here now. Isn't that enough?" "No, it's not enough," I snapped, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "You died, Grandma. You left us. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To Mom and Dad? We buried you. We mourned you." Her gaze softened, sadness etched into every line of her translucent face. "And I'm sorry for that pain. Truly I am. But holding on to your grief won't bring me back. It only keeps you trapped." Her words struck a chord deep within me, stirring emotions I'd worked so hard to suppress. Guilt, anger, regret. They swirled together like storm clouds, threatening to overwhelm me. Yet beneath it all lay a kernel of truth, one I wasn't ready to confront. "You keep saying I need to let go," I muttered bitterly. "But what does that even mean? How do I just stop missing you?" "It's not about forgetting," she replied gently. "It's about remembering differently. Honoring the love we shared without letting it weigh you down. You deserve happiness, sweetheart. Not a lifetime of sorrow." As she spoke, the room shifted subtly. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that resembled faces, some smiling, others grimacing. The photographs scattered across the table began to tremble, their frames vibrating faintly. Even the recipe book in my hands grew colder, its pages stiffening as though frozen. "Why are you really here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" Her answer was simple, yet devastating. "To say goodbye." Before I could respond, she reached out, her hand hovering inches above mine. Instinctively, I flinched, but instead of pulling away, I allowed her touch to linger. It was icy, sending shivers coursing through my veins, yet somehow comforting. Like a final embrace meant to ease the ache of separation. "I love you," she murmured, her form beginning to fade. "Always remember that." And then she was gone. Just like that. One moment she stood before me, the next she vanished into thin air, leaving behind only silence and the lingering scent of lavender. For a long while I sat there, staring at the empty doorway. Part of me wanted to chase after her, demand answers, beg her to stay. But another part, the stronger, wiser part, knew it was futile. Whatever force had brought her back, it wasn't bound by human rules or desires. She had come to deliver a message, and now it was up to me to decipher its meaning. Clutching the recipe book tighter, I made a silent vow. I wouldn't forget her. Not her laughter, not her wisdom, not the countless moments we'd shared. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to start remembering her differently. To honor her memory not with tears, but with joy. Little did I know this was only the beginning. After my grandmother disappeared for the second time, I felt like I'd been left dangling over an abyss, with no safety net in sight. Her visit had stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried months ago, and now they clawed their way back to the surface with a vengeance. Grief, guilt, confusion, they all swirled inside me like a storm threatening to tear me apart. The attic grew colder as I sat there alone, surrounded by relics of her life. The recipe book still clutched in my hand seemed heavier than before, its pages crackling faintly as though infused with some unseen energy. I couldn't bring myself to put it down, not yet. It was like holding onto a piece of her, fragile and fleeting but tangible nonetheless. My mind kept circling back to one question. Why me? Of all the people she could have visited, my parents, my siblings, even old friends, why did she choose to come to me? Was it because we were close? Or was there something deeper, something she needed from me specifically? As if answering my unspoken thoughts, the air shifted again. This time it wasn't just cold, it was oppressive, suffocating, like invisible hands pressing against my chest. My breath hitched as I scanned the room, searching for any sign of her return. But instead of her familiar figure, I noticed something far more unsettling. The photographs on the table, the ones I'd been flipping through earlier, were moving. Not dramatically, not like in those cheesy horror movies where pictures scream or bleed. No, this was subtler, almost imperceptible. Faces blurred slightly, expressions morphed, and backgrounds shifted. In one photo, Grandma stood beside me at the Thanksgiving table, but now she appeared farther away, her smile fading into something distant and sorrowful. Panic bubbled in my throat as I reached for the nearest frame. When I touched it, the glass fogged instantly, frost spreading outward in intricate patterns. For a split second, I swore I saw words forming within the icy swirls. Let go. I dropped the frame with a gasp, scrambling backward until my spine hit the wall. My heart thundered in my ears as I stared at the shattered remains of the photograph. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or was this another message from beyond? Desperate for answers, I grabbed my phone and typed ghost activity signs into the search bar. Pages upon pages of forums, articles, and videos popped up, detailing encounters with spirits, poltergeists, and other supernatural phenomena. Some claimed these entities sought closure. Others warned they might be malevolent forces masquerading as loved ones. None of it brought me comfort. In fact, it only deepened my unease. One article caught my attention. How to communicate with spirits without losing your sanity. Skeptical but desperate, I skimmed through the tips. Light candles, speak clearly, ask direct questions, avoid mirrors. Mirrors? That last bit stopped me cold. Why avoid mirrors? Curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me toward the vanity mirror tucked in the corner of the attic. Its surface gleamed innocently under the dim light, reflecting nothing but dust motes swirling in the stale air. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I stepped closer. And then I saw it. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the reflection like a shadow passing too quickly to catch. Then, gradually, the image sharpened. Behind me, standing perfectly still, was my grandmother. Except, she wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on something, or someone else entirely. I spun around, half expecting to see her standing in the room. But no one was there. Just empty space, heavy with silence. When I turned back to the mirror, she was gone. That's when the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. But as I stood frozen before the mirror, they grew louder, clearer. Voices layered atop one another, overlapping in a cacophony of murmurs that made my head spin. Most of them were unintelligible, mere fragments of sentences strung together without context. But one phrase stood out, repeated over and over again. She can't stay. It wasn't her voice this time. These voices belonged to strangers, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They filled the room, surrounding me, suffocating me. I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut as though blocking out the physical world would silence them too. But it didn't work. If anything, the noise intensified, growing sharper, more insistent. Tears streamed down my face as I sank to the floor, curling into a ball. Please stop, I begged silently. Please make it stop. And then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos ceased. The voices faded into silence, leaving behind only the dull hum of the house settling around me. Trembling, I opened my eyes and looked up at the mirror once more. There she was again, Grandma. Only this time she wasn't alone. Behind her loomed figures cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured by darkness. They crowded around her, reaching out with skeletal fingers, whispering words I couldn't understand. She looked smaller somehow, frilier, as though their presence drained her strength. Yet despite their menacing forms, she remained calm, almost serene. "Who are they?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "They're waiting," she replied, her tone tinged with sadness. For me, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She hadn't come back simply to say goodbye. She was stuck, caught between worlds, unable to move on because of me, because of my refusal to let her go. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears streaming freely now. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said softly. "But it's time, sweetheart. Time for both of us to heal." With that, she raised her hand, palm facing the mirror. The glass cracked violently, shards exploding outward like shrapnel. I shielded my face, bracing for impact, but none came. When I lowered my arms, the mirror was intact, its surface smooth and unbroken. And she was gone. 4 hours afterward, I sat in stunned silence, replaying everything that had happened. Each detail clicked into place, forming a picture I couldn't ignore any longer. She wasn't haunting me, she was trying to save me. From what exactly I wasn't sure. But one thing was certain, I couldn't keep clinging to her memory like this. Eventually, I gathered the courage to leave the attic, carrying the recipe book downstairs with me. As I placed it gently on the kitchen counter, I noticed something I'd missed before. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. It was a letter addressed to me. "Dear sweetheart, if you're reading this, then chances are I've already said my goodbyes. Don't be sad. I lived a full, beautiful life and I wouldn't trade a single moment of it for anything. But now it's your turn to live yours. Letting go isn't easy, I know. Trust me, I've spent enough nights lying awake wondering how to make things right. But holding on too tightly only keeps us tethered to the past. You deserve better than that. You deserve joy, laughter, love, all the things I wanted for you since the day you were born. So please don't cry for me. Instead, remember the happy times. Bake my recipes, share stories about me, laugh at my silly jokes. Keep me alive in your heart, not in your grief. I'll always be with you, watching over you. Even if you can't see me, I promise I'm here. Love forever, Grandma." By the time I finished reading, I was sobbing uncontrollably. Not out of sorrow this time, but out of gratitude. She hadn't abandoned me, she'd given me exactly what I needed most, permission to let her go. Over the next few days, I began taking steps toward healing. I cleaned out her belongings, donating clothes and keepsakes to charity while keeping a few cherished items for myself. I cooked her recipes, filling the house with smells that reminded me of home. And slowly, painstakingly, I started letting go, not of her memory but of the pain that had anchored me to it for so long. Yet even as I moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching over me. Sometimes late at night, I'd catch a whiff of lavender drifting through the air. Other times, I'd hear faint laughter echoing in empty rooms. It wasn't frightening, it was comforting, a reminder that she hadn't truly left. But deep down, I knew our story wasn't over. Something, or someone, was still waiting in the wings, watching, biding its time. Whatever it was, I wasn't ready to face it yet. Not until I understood exactly what she meant when she said, "They're waiting." The days following the discovery of my grandmother's letter were a mix of progress and unease. On one hand, I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. I started sleeping better, eating more, and even ventured out to meet friends for coffee, something I'd avoided since her death. It was as if she'd handed me a key to unlock the prison of grief I'd built around myself. But on the other hand, there were whispers. At first, I dismissed them as figments of my imagination, residual echoes from the night in the attic when the voices had overwhelmed me. They were faint, barely audible over the hum of daily life. A soft murmur here, a distant sigh there. Nothing concrete enough to alarm me, or so I told myself. That changed one evening while I was preparing dinner. The kitchen was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of onions caramelizing in butter, a recipe straight from Grandma's book. As I stirred the pot, humming absently to myself, I heard it, a voice. Clearer this time, unmistakable. "Don't forget." I froze, the wooden spoon slipping from my fingers and clattering against the stove. My heart raced as I turned slowly, scanning the room. Empty. Just me and the simmering saucepan. Yet the voice lingered, reverberating softly in the corners of the kitchen. "Forget what?" I whispered, half expecting no response. Instead, the answer came immediately, sharp and insistent. What you promised. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Promised? What promise? I hadn't made any promises, not consciously anyway. Unless she meant letting go. Before I could dwell on it further, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the flashlight tucked in a drawer. When the beam cut through the shadows, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. On the wall above the sink, written in what looked like frost, were 3 chilling words. They're still waiting. My breath hitched as memories of the shadowy figures from the mirror flooded back. Who or what were they? And why did they seem so intent on reminding me of their presence? Determined not to let fear consume me, I grabbed a dish towel and wiped away the message. As soon as the last letter disappeared, the lights flickered back on, steady and bright. For a moment, everything returned to normal. The sizzle of onions, the ticking of the clock, the quiet solitude of being alone in the house. Or so I thought. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the whispers returned. Louder now, overlapping each other in an incomprehensible jumble. Some sounded pleading, others accusatory. One voice stood out among the rest, a low, guttural tone that sent shivers down my spine. She hasn't fulfilled her part. Fulfilled her part? What did that mean? Was this some kind of cosmic bargain I didn't understand? Had my grandmother struck a deal before she died, and now it fell to me to honor it? Sleep eluded me entirely after that. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window, set my nerves on edge. By morning, exhaustion had taken its toll, leaving me groggy and irritable. Still, I forced myself to get up and face the day, clinging to the hope that the voices would fade once I left the confines of the house. I decided to visit my parents, hoping their company might distract me from the growing sense of dread gnawing at my insides. Their home was always a sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of the past seemed less intrusive. Or so I hoped. When I arrived, Mom greeted me with a tight hug, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She'd been struggling too, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of strength. Dad sat in his armchair, staring blankly at the television, a glass of whiskey dangling loosely from his fingers. "I'm glad you're here," Mom said, pulling me toward the couch. "We've missed you." Her words tugged at my heartstrings, guilt washing over me for staying away for so long. We spent the afternoon talking about trivial things, work, neighbors, upcoming holidays, anything to avoid discussing the elephant in the room. But eventually, the conversation drifted to her. "She used to love this time of year," Mom murmured wistfully, gesturing to the pumpkin decorations scattered across the living room. "Always insisted on baking pies until midnight, no matter how tired she was." A pang of nostalgia hit me, followed quickly by unease. Even here, surrounded by family, I couldn't escape her memory, or the feeling that she was lingering nearby. As if on cue, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Dad shivered visibly, wrapping a blanket tighter around his shoulders. "Feels like someone opened a window," he muttered, glancing around. "No windows are open," Mom replied sharply, her gaze darting toward the fireplace. The flames flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then I saw it, reflected faintly in the glass of a framed photograph on the mantel. Grandma, standing just behind Mom, her expression unreadable. My stomach churned as I stared, unable to look away. Neither of my parents noticed. They continued chatting, oblivious to the ghostly figure hovering mere feet away. Part of me wanted to scream, to point her out and demand answers. But another part, the rational, terrified part, knew better than to disrupt whatever fragile balance held her here. Instead, I excused myself, claiming I needed fresh air. Outside, the crisp autumn breeze did little to calm my racing thoughts. Why was she showing herself to me again? What did she want me to do? As if summoned by my silent plea, a whisper brushed against my ear. Not inside the house this time, but out here in the open air. "Find me." The voice was hers, unmistakably hers. Soft yet urgent, tinged with desperation. Find her? But how? She was already gone. Buried. At peace, or so I thought. I stumbled back inside, shaken to my core. My parents glanced up, concern etched into their faces. "Are you okay?" Mom asked, reaching for my hand. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But I wasn't fine. Not even close. Because deep down I knew the truth. Grandma wasn't at peace. Something, or someone, was keeping her tethered to this world. And unless I figured out why, she might never truly leave. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research, scouring online forums and dusty library books for information about spirits, hauntings, and unfinished business. Most of it was pseudoscience or outright nonsense, but one recurring theme caught my attention. Mirrors. Mirrors, according to legend, served as portals between worlds. Fragile boundaries where the living and the dead could intersect, if they dared. That explained why I'd seen her in the attic mirror, why the voices had grown louder whenever I approached reflective surfaces. But it also raised a terrifying question. What happened if I crossed that boundary? Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I resolved to find out. Armed with candles, salt, apparently useful for protection, and a notebook to document whatever happened, I returned to the attic late one night. The space felt different this time, heavier, charged with an energy that prickled my skin. Placing the items carefully on the floor, I positioned myself in front of the vanity mirror. Its surface gleamed innocently under the flickering candlelight, reflecting nothing but my own anxious face. Taking a deep breath, I whispered the question burning in my mind. "Grandma, are you there?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the reflection began to change. My features blurred, shifting into something unfamiliar. Shadows crept along the edges of the glass, twisting into shapes that resembled hands, reaching, grasping. And then she appeared. Not behind me, but within the mirror itself, standing amidst a sea of darkness. Her form shimmered faintly, like static on an old television screen. Behind her loomed the same shadowy figures I'd seen before, their faces obscured by veils of smoke. "Why won't you let her go?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from her?" Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Frustrated, I leaned closer, straining to catch even a fragment of sound. That's when the glass cracked violently, shards exploding outward like shrapnel. I shielded my face, bracing for impact, but none came. When I lowered my arms, the mirror was intact, its surface smooth and unbroken. And she was gone. But the whispers remained. "They're coming for you." The attic felt different after the mirror incident, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The air was heavier, colder, as though the room itself had become a living entity, breathing and watching me. My reflection stared back at me from the now intact mirror, but it didn't feel like me anymore. It felt like something else, an imposter wearing my face. I backed away slowly, clutching the notebook and salt I'd brought for protection. Every step creaked ominously beneath my feet, amplifying the tension coiling in my chest. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder now, overlapping voices forming a cacophony of murmurs that seemed to seep into my very bones. "They're coming for you," one voice hissed again, clearer this time. Its tone was taunting, almost gleeful, as if relishing the fear spreading through me. "Who's coming?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound brave. "What do you want?" No answer came, not directly anyway. Instead, the shadows stretching across the walls began to shift unnaturally, twisting into grotesque shapes that resembled figures. Humanoid but distorted, their limbs elongated, heads tilted at impossible angles. They moved silently, gliding toward me without making a sound. Panic surged through me as I scrambled backward, knocking over the candles I'd placed earlier. Their flames flickered wildly before extinguishing, plunging the attic into near-total darkness. Only the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the dusty window provided any illumination, and even that seemed tainted somehow, casting everything in an eerie silver hue. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for its flashlight function to cut through the oppressive gloom. When the beam finally illuminated the space, what I saw froze me in place. The figures were closer now, crowding around me in a tight circle. Their faces remained obscured, hidden behind veils of shadow, but their eyes glowed faintly red, yellow, green. Multicolored pinpricks of light staring hungrily at me. One of them reached out, its hands skeletal and claw-like, brushing against my shoulder. The touch sent a jolt of ice through my veins, paralyzing me momentarily. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, tripping over the overturned candlesticks. Pain shot through my palms as they hit the hard wooden floor, but adrenaline kept me moving. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. But the voices followed. Downstairs, in the safety, or so I thought, of my bedroom, I tried to calm myself. Breathing deeply, I repeated the same mantra over and over in my head. "It's not real. It's just your imagination. None of this is real." Except it was. Too vivid, too visceral to dismiss as mere hallucination or stress-induced paranoia. Something was happening, something beyond my understanding. And whatever it was, it wasn't done with me yet. Desperate for answers, I turned to the notebook I'd grabbed from the attic. Flipping through its pages, I found hastily scribbled notes about mirrors, spirits, and unfinished business. One passage stood out, highlighted in bold letters. Spirits trapped between worlds often seek closure, but beware, some bargains come at a price. Closure. That word echoed in my mind, tying together every strange encounter I'd experienced since Grandma's death. She wasn't haunting me, she was trying to communicate. But what? What unresolved issue bound her to this world? And then it hit me, the grave. We'd buried her quickly, too quickly, consumed by grief and logistical details. No proper funeral, no ceremony to honor her life. Just a quiet interment attended by immediate family. Could that be it? Had we neglected some crucial ritual, leaving her spirit tethered to the mortal plane? Determined to find out, I decided to visit the cemetery where she was laid to rest. Armed with a bouquet of lilies, one of her favorite flowers, I drove to the outskirts of town, parking near the wrought iron gates. The graveyard stretched endlessly before me, rows upon rows of headstones glowing faintly under the pale light of the moon. Finding hers took longer than expected. By the time I located the modest marker engraved with her name, sweat dripped down my back despite the chill in the air. Dropping to my knees, I placed the flowers carefully at the base of the stone and whispered a silent prayer. "I'm sorry," I murmured, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "If we failed you, please forgive us. We only wanted to protect ourselves from the pain." As I spoke, the ground beneath me shifted slightly as though responding to my words. Startled, I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the shadows. But the cemetery remained empty, save for the rustling leaves and distant hoot of an owl. That's when I noticed it. Carved into the marble beside her name were symbols I didn't recognize, strange runes etched faintly into the surface. At first glance, they blended seamlessly with the natural texture of the stone, almost invisible unless you looked closely. But now that I'd seen them, they seemed glaringly obvious. Heart pounding, I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture. Maybe someone online could decipher their meaning. For now, though, I focused on the task at hand, saying goodbye properly. "Grandma," I said aloud, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know how much I love you. How much I miss you. You gave me so much, your wisdom, your kindness, your strength. I'll carry those lessons with me always." Tears streamed freely now, blurring my vision as I continued. "I promise to let you go, to live fully, joyfully, the way you always wanted me to. Please, if there's anything left unsaid, tell me. Help me understand." Silence greeted my plea, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through trees. For a moment, I feared I'd imagined the entire exchange, that none of this mattered, that she was truly gone forever. Then the temperature dropped sharply. Frost spread outward from the base of the headstone, crystallizing the grass beneath my hands. A familiar scent filled the air, lavender, and with it came her voice, faint but unmistakable. "It's not enough." My stomach churned as I turned slowly, searching for her form among the shadows. "What isn't enough?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What more do you need?" "The truth," she replied simply. "Find it and you'll understand." Before I could press further, the frost vanished, leaving behind only damp earth and wilting flowers. Alone once more, I sat there for hours, staring at the symbols carved into her gravestone. Whatever secrets they held, they were the key to unlocking the mystery surrounding her lingering presence. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but clarity had begun to take root. This wasn't just about closure, it was about uncovering the truth. About facing whatever forces kept her tethered to this world and freeing her once and for all. Little did I know, the journey ahead would lead me deeper into darkness than I ever imagined possible. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a sense of unease that clung to me like a second skin. The encounter at the cemetery replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Her voice whispering cryptically about the truth, the strange symbols carved into her gravestone, the frost spreading unnaturally across the ground. It was all too much to process, yet one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I started by uploading the photo of the gravestone symbols to various online forums dedicated to paranormal activity and cryptography. Within hours, responses poured in, from skeptics dismissing them as random scratches to conspiracy theorists claiming they were ancient runes tied to occult rituals. One user stood out, however. Their username was Shadow Seeker, and their reply was concise yet chilling. "These are binding sigils. Someone, or something, is keeping her spirit anchored here." Binding sigils? Anchored? My stomach churned as I clicked on Shadow Seeker's profile, searching for more information. They seemed credible enough. Posts filled with detailed analyses of supernatural phenomena, references to obscure texts, even photos of similar markings found in other haunted locations. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was them. Summoning my courage, I sent a private message. Hi, I came across these symbols on my grandmother's grave after some strange experiences. You mentioned they're binding sigils. Can you explain what that means? And how do I break it? Minutes later, a response appeared. Be careful. Binding sigils are powerful tools used to trap spirits between worlds. Breaking one isn't easy, it requires confronting whoever cast it. Are you prepared for that? I hesitated before typing back. Yes, whatever it takes. Their next message sent chills down my spine. Good. Because once you start, there's no turning back. Meet me tomorrow night at midnight at the old library downtown. Bring the photo and nothing else. The old library loomed before me like a relic from another era. Its brick facade was crumbling, windows boarded up, ivy creeping along the walls like skeletal fingers. A faint glow emanated from within, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn around and go home, I stepped inside. The interior smelled of mildew and decay, books piled haphazardly on shelves coated in dust. At the center of the room stood a long wooden table, illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. Seated at the far end was Shadow Seeker, or rather, the person behind the username. They wore a hooded cloak that obscured their face, leaving only a pair of piercing eyes visible beneath the fabric. You came, they said. Their voice low and gravelly. Brave or foolish, I haven't decided yet. I need answers, I replied, clutching the photo tightly in my hand. What are these symbols? Who put them there? Shadow Seeker gestured for me to sit, pulling the photo closer to examine it under the candlelight. As I suspected, they muttered. Binding sigils designed to trap your grandmother's spirit. But breaking them won't be simple. These marks require intent, a purposeful act performed by someone who knew her intimately. My heart sank. You think someone in my family did this? It's likely, they admitted grimly. Someone close to her, someone who didn't want to let go. Or worse, someone who wanted control over her spirit. Control? Over her spirit? The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. Was this why she'd been visiting me? Warning me? Trying to guide me toward uncovering the truth? What happens if we don't break them? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. They'll keep her tethered indefinitely, Shadow Seeker explained. And eventually the strain will corrupt her soul. She'll become something darker. A shiver ran down my spine. How do we stop it? There's a ritual, they said cautiously. But it's dangerous. If done incorrectly, it could unleash whatever force is holding her captive, or worse, bind you instead. Despite the warning, I nodded firmly. Tell me what I need to do. According to Shadow Seeker, the ritual required 3 key components. 1. Salt circles, to protect against malevolent entities. 2. Her personal belongings, items imbued with her energy, such as jewelry or clothing. 3. A spoken invocation, words meant to sever the connection between her spirit and the sigils. They handed me a folded piece of paper containing the incantation, written in Latin. Memorize this, they instructed. Speak it clearly and without hesitation. Any mistake could cost you dearly. I spent the rest of the day gathering supplies and rehearsing the invocation until the words rolled off my tongue effortlessly. By sunset, I returned to the cemetery, armed with salt, candles, and a small box containing Grandma's favorite locket. The air felt heavier than usual as I approached her grave. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the landscape, twisting into shapes that resembled figures lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Ignoring the growing sense of dread, I began constructing the salt circle around the headstone, sprinkling the granules carefully to form an unbroken ring. Once the circle was complete, I lit the candles placed at each cardinal direction, north, south, east, west, and positioned the locket at the center of the gravestone. Taking a deep breath, I recited the invocation aloud, my voice trembling but steady. Spiritus vinculum frangitor, umbri salvanter. Requiescat in pace. Break the spirit's chains, release the shadows. Rest in peace. At first nothing happened. Then slowly the ground beneath me trembled. Frost spread outward from the base of the headstone, crystallizing the grass and wilting flowers. The symbols carved into the marble glowed faintly, pulsating with an otherworldly light. Suddenly a figure emerged from the darkness. Not Grandma, but someone familiar. Too familiar. It was my mother. She stood just outside the salt circle, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, usually warm and comforting, now gleamed with an unsettling intensity. In her hands she held a dagger etched with intricate designs, the same patterns as the sigils on the gravestone. "Stop this," she commanded, her voice sharp and commanding. "You don't know what you're doing." Shock rooted me to the spot. "Mom? What? Why are you here?" "I did it for us," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't bear to lose her, not completely. So I bound her spirit, thinking I could bring her back someday. I thought I was helping." "Helping?" I echoed incredulously. "You've been torturing her, keeping her trapped between worlds, forcing her to watch us suffer." "I didn't mean to hurt her," she cried, clutching the dagger tightly. "Please, you have to understand." "No," I said firmly, stepping closer to the edge of the salt circle. "This ends tonight." Before she could protest further, I raised my voice and repeated the invocation, louder this time. The ground shook violently as the symbols on the gravestone shattered, cracking the marble into pieces. A blinding flash of light erupted from the site, engulfing the entire cemetery in its glow. When the light faded, Mom collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Behind her, Grandma materialized briefly, smiling softly before vanishing into thin air. "She's free," Shadowseeker whispered, appearing beside me. "For better or worse." Exhaustion washed over me as I stared at the broken gravestone, finally understanding the weight of what had transpired. Freeing her hadn't just been about closure, it had been about forgiveness. For both her and ourselves. But as we left the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows still lingered. Watching. Waiting. The days following the ritual were a blur of conflicting emotions. Relief warred with guilt, joy mingled with sorrow. Grandma was finally free, or so I told myself, but the aftermath left me unsettled. My mother had confessed to binding her spirit out of grief and desperation, but the act itself felt like a betrayal. How could she have done something so selfish? And what consequences might still linger because of it? Despite these lingering doubts, life seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy. The whispers that had haunted me for weeks quieted, replaced by an almost eerie silence. No more frost spreading across surfaces, no more figures lurking in mirrors or shadows twisting unnaturally. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up drenched in sweat. Yet beneath the surface calm, unease simmered. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me. Waiting. It started subtly as most horrors do. A faint chill in the air during otherwise warm evenings. The scent of lavender drifting through rooms where no flowers existed. At first, I dismissed it as residual energy from the ritual, a final goodbye perhaps before Grandma moved on completely. But then came the dreams. They weren't ordinary nightmares. They were vivid, immersive experiences that felt indistinguishable from reality. In each dream, I found myself standing in the cemetery, staring at her broken gravestone. The symbols carved into the marble reappeared, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Behind me, shadows loomed, their forms shifting into grotesque shapes that reminded me of the figures from the attic. And always there was the whisper. "You shouldn't have freed her." I woke up gasping every time, drenched in sweat, heart pounding wildly. The voice wasn't hers, it belonged to something else, something darker. Something angry. By the fourth consecutive night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Desperate for answers, I reached out to Shadowseeker again, explaining the recurring dreams and growing sense of dread. Their response was immediate and chilling. "Be careful. Freeing her may have angered whatever force was controlling her spirit. It's possible the binding sigils were placed not by your mother alone, but by something far older and more powerful." Older and more powerful? My stomach churned at the thought. What kind of entity would manipulate human grief to trap a soul? And why? Shadow Seeker suggested performing another protective ritual to ward off potential retaliation. Armed with salt, candles, and written instructions, I prepared myself for another confrontation, not with spirits this time, but with whatever malevolent force now sought revenge. That night, I set up the ritual in my living room, creating a large salt circle around the perimeter of the space. Candles burned brightly at each corner, casting flickering light across the walls. At the center of the circle, I placed Grandma's locket once again, hoping its energy might provide additional protection. As instructed, I began reciting the incantation aloud, my voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in my chest. The Latin phrases rolled off my tongue smoothly, filling the room with an almost tangible energy. Shadows danced along the edges of the circle, drawn inward by the invocation yet unable to cross the barrier of salt. But then, halfway through the ritual, something went wrong. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to relight them, but the matches wouldn't strike. The air grew colder, so cold that frost began forming on the walls and furniture. My breath misted visibly in front of me as I backed away, clutching the locket tightly. From the darkness emerged a figure, tall, imposing, its form obscured by swirling smoke. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the gloom like embers. When it spoke, its voice reverberated unnaturally, shaking the very foundation of the house. "You meddled where you did not belong," it hissed. "Now you will pay the price." Instinctively, I stepped backward, only to feel my heel brush against the edge of the salt circle. Before I could react, the creature lunged forward, its hand reaching out to grab mine. The moment its fingers touched my skin, an icy shock coursed through my body, paralyzing me instantly. Pain unlike anything I'd ever experienced shot through my veins, freezing my muscles and clouding my vision. Through the haze, I heard Shadow Seeker's warning echo in my mind. Any mistake could cost you dearly. This was no mere warning, it was a prophecy coming true. Summoning every ounce of strength I possessed, I wrenched my hand free from the creature's grasp and stumbled back into the center of the salt circle. The locket in my palm burned suddenly hot, its metal searing my skin. Acting purely on instinct, I hurled it toward the figure, shouting the remainder of the incantation with all the force I could muster. Abiat et non revertator. Depart and do not return. The room erupted in chaos. Wind howled violently, tearing at curtains and scattering papers. The salt circle cracked under the pressure, breaking apart just as the creature let out an ear-splitting scream. Light exploded from the locket, engulfing the figure in a blinding flash. When the brightness faded, the creature was gone. Breathing heavily, I collapsed onto the floor, trembling uncontrollably. The house was silent once more, save for the faint crackle of dying candle flames. Exhaustion washed over me, pulling me into unconsciousness. When I awoke hours later, sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the frost-covered surfaces. Everything appeared normal, too normal. Yet I knew better than to trust appearances. My phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table, notifications piling up. Among them was a message from Shadow Seeker. "You survived. Consider yourself lucky. But remember, forces like that don't disappear easily. Stay vigilant." Vigilant. That word stuck with me as I cleaned up the remnants of the ritual. Whatever entity had been controlling Grandma's spirit, it was still out there, watching, waiting. And while I'd managed to drive it away temporarily, I couldn't shake the feeling that our battle was far from over. In the days that followed, strange occurrences resumed. Objects moved inexplicably, doors slammed shut on their own, and the temperature in certain rooms plummeted without explanation. Each incident served as a grim reminder. Freeing Grandma hadn't ended the nightmare, it had merely shifted its focus. To me, sleep became my enemy after that night. What had once been a refuge, a chance to escape the chaos of waking life, was now a battlefield where shadows fought for control of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I braced myself for the inevitable descent into darkness. And every time the nightmares came, they weren't ordinary dreams, they felt too real, too visceral. The kind of dreams that leave you gasping for air, heart pounding, convinced you're still trapped within them even after you wake up. Each one began the same way. I'd find myself standing in the cemetery, staring at Grandma's shattered gravestone. But instead of peace, the scene radiated dread. The symbols carved into the marble glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. Shadows slithered across the ground, coalescing into grotesque shapes that loomed closer with each passing moment. And then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves or distant wind. But as the dream progressed, they grew louder, more insistent. Voices layered atop one another, overlapping in a cacophony of murmurs that made my head spin. Some sounded pleading, others accusatory. One voice stood out among the rest, a low, guttural tone that sent shivers down my spine. You shouldn't have freed her. It wasn't Grandma's voice this time. Nor was it the angry hiss of the creature from the ritual. This voice belonged to something ancient, something primal. Its words carried weight as though imbued with centuries of malice. No matter how hard I tried to block it out, it wormed its way into my thoughts, planting seeds of doubt and fear. You don't belong here, I whispered back, clutching the edges of my sweater tightly. My breath misted visibly in the cold air, fogging the space around me. Leave me alone. The laughter that followed was chilling, a deep, rumbling sound that reverberated through the graveyard like thunder. It mocked me, taunting me with the knowledge that I was powerless against whatever force controlled these dreams. You think you can fight me? The voice sneered. I've walked this earth long before your bloodline existed. Long before your grandmother drew her first breath. Do you truly believe you stand a chance? Before I could respond, the ground beneath me trembled violently. Cracks spread outward from the base of the gravestone, splitting the earth like jagged veins. Frost erupted along the fissures, crystallizing everything in its path. From the depths emerged figures cloaked in shadow, the same ones I'd seen during the ritual. Their faces remained obscured, hidden behind veils of smoke, but their glowing eyes locked onto mine with predatory intensity. One of them stepped forward, reaching out with skeletal fingers. I stumbled backward, tripping over uneven terrain until my back hit a tree. Its bark dug painfully into my skin, but I barely registered the sensation. All I could focus on was the figure advancing toward me, its form shifting unnaturally as though defying the laws of physics. Please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. What do you want from me? Its answer came not in words but in action. With a swift motion, it pressed its hand against my forehead. Instantly, searing pain shot through my skull, spreading like wildfire through my veins. Memories flooded my mind. Fragments of my childhood, moments spent with Grandma, even glimpses of events I didn't recognize. They played out like scenes from a movie, disjointed yet horrifyingly vivid. Then came the visions. I saw myself standing in the attic again, surrounded by photographs and relics of Grandma's life. Except this time the room was filled with people, or rather, spirits. Faces blurred together, voices overlapping in an incomprehensible jumble. Among them I spotted her, Grandma. She looked different now, frilier, as though drained of vitality. Her gaze met mine briefly before she turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Next, I found myself in the cemetery once more, but the landscape had changed. Tombstones stretched endlessly in every direction, their surfaces etched with unfamiliar names and symbols. At the center stood a massive altar, constructed entirely of black stone. Upon it lay a body draped in white cloth. As I approached, the fabric shifted, revealing Grandma's face, but her eyes were empty, devoid of life or recognition. A figure emerged from the shadows behind the altar. Cloaked in darkness, its presence exuded pure malevolence. In its hands, it held a dagger identical to the one Mom had wielded during the ritual. Without hesitation, it plunged the blade into Grandma's chest. No! I screamed, lunging forward to stop it. But my legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as though bound by invisible chains. Helpless, I watched as light poured from her wound, illuminating the surrounding area. When the glow faded, she was gone, and the figure turned its attention to me. Your turn, it whispered, raising the bloodied dagger. I woke up screaming. Sweat drenched my sheets, sticking to my skin as I bolted upright in bed. My heart raced wildly, hammering against my ribcage like it wanted to escape. For several minutes, I sat there, clutching my knees to my chest, trying to calm my breathing. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a dream. But deep down, I knew better. Daylight offered little comfort. Shadows seemed longer, darker, stretching unnaturally across walls and floors. Objects moved inexplicably, a mug sliding off the counter, a book falling from a shelf. Even the house itself felt different, heavier, as though burdened by unseen weight. Desperate for answers, I reached out to Shadow Seeker again. Their response was brief but ominous. Dream manipulation is a sign of possession. Whatever entity haunts you is growing stronger. Possession? The word sent ice coursing through my veins. Was it possible? Could the creature from my nightmares actually be inside me, feeding off my fear and memories? That night, I fortified the salt circles around my bedroom, lit candles, and recited protective incantations until my voice grew hoarse. Yet none of it stopped the dreams. If anything, they worsened. Each vision brought new horrors, twisted versions of loved ones, landscapes warped beyond recognition, and always the looming presence of the cloaked figure. By morning, I felt hollow, drained, as though the dreams themselves were siphoning my energy. On the third consecutive night, something changed. Instead of ending abruptly, the dream lingered. I found myself standing in the cemetery once more, but this time Grandma appeared, not frail or corrupted, but radiant, glowing with an ethereal light. "They're using you," she said softly, her voice carrying both sadness and urgency. "To get to me." "What do you mean?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "How can I stop them?" Her expression softened, tinged with regret. "You can't. Not alone." Before I could press further, the shadows converged, swallowing her whole. The cloaked figure reappeared, raising the dagger high above its head. Pain exploded through my chest as the blade pierced my skin. I woke up gasping, clutching my torso. There was no wound, no blood, but the ache lingered, throbbing like a phantom limb. Grandma's warning echoed in my mind, "Not alone." If I wanted to survive, I needed help. And I knew exactly who to call. After the latest nightmare, I knew I couldn't face this alone. Whatever force was manipulating my dreams, and possibly my reality, was too powerful for me to handle on my own. Desperation drove me to pick up the phone and dial Shadowseeker's number. To my relief, they answered immediately. "I need your help," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "The dreams, they're getting worse." And Grandma, she appeared again. She said something about them using me to get to her. Silence stretched across the line before Shadowseeker responded, their tone grave. "This confirms it. The entity isn't just angry, it's strategic. By targeting you, it hopes to weaken her spirit enough to reclaim control." "But why me?" I asked, clutching the phone tightly. "Why not Mom or someone else?" "Because you're the one who broke the binding sigils," they explained. "You became the link between her freedom and its power. Now it sees you as a threat and a tool." Their words sent chills down my spine. A threat and a tool? The thought of being used like some kind of vessel made my stomach churn. But there was no time to dwell on it. If we didn't act quickly, things would only escalate further. "We need to return to the cemetery," Shadowseeker instructed. "There's unfinished business there, something tied to her grave that needs addressing. Meet me at midnight." By the time I arrived at the graveyard, the air felt heavier than ever, laden with an oppressive energy that made each step feel like trudging through molasses. Shadowseeker stood waiting near the entrance, cloaked in darkness once more. In their hands they carried a leather satchel filled with supplies. Salt, candles, herbs, and what looked like shards of obsidian. "This won't be easy," they warned as we approached Grandma's grave. "Whatever is haunting you has roots here. We'll have to dig deep, literally and figuratively." I nodded, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead. Together, we began constructing another protective circle around the site, sprinkling salt liberally and placing candles at strategic points. As the ritual preparations took shape, I noticed something strange about the ground beneath us. The earth seemed uneven, as though disturbed recently, or perhaps centuries ago. Shadowseeker knelt beside the gravestone, running their fingers over the cracks where the symbols had once been. "These markings were only part of the trap," they murmured. "Something else lies buried here. Something older." Without hesitation, they handed me a small shovel. "Start digging." The soil was damp and cold, clinging stubbornly to the blade of the shovel as I dug. My muscles burned with exertion, but adrenaline kept me going. Each thrust into the earth brought fresh waves of dread. I half expected skeletal hands to burst forth and drag me underground. After nearly 20 minutes of relentless digging, the shovel struck something solid. Heart pounding, I leaned down and brushed away the dirt to reveal a wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox. Its surface was intricately carved with the same symbols etched into the gravestone, the binding sigils. "What is this?" I whispered, glancing at Shadow Seeker. "They call it a soul anchor," they replied grimly. "A physical object used to tether spirits to the mortal plane. Your mother may have cast the initial spell, but this artifact predates her involvement. Whoever created it intended for your grandmother's spirit to remain trapped indefinitely." My hands trembled as I lifted the box from the hole. It was surprisingly light, yet radiated an unsettling chill. Opening it revealed a collection of items: strands of hair, fragments of fabric, and a locket identical to the one I'd used during the previous ritual. But nestled among these relics was something far more sinister: a blackened bone shard wrapped in parchment inscribed with arcane script. "This is bad," Shadow Seeker muttered, examining the contents. "Very bad. This isn't just a simple binding spell, it's necromancy. Someone, or something, wanted to ensure her spirit could never cross over." Necromancy. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Not only had Grandma been bound against her will, but dark magic had been involved all along. Anger surged within me, mingling with grief and guilt. How many layers of betrayal did this go back? Who had orchestrated such cruelty? "We need to destroy it," Shadow Seeker declared firmly. "But not here." Performing the destruction ritual in the cemetery risks awakening whatever force placed it here in the first place. Reluctantly, I agreed. Carefully wrapping the box in cloth, I tucked it under my arm and followed Shadow Seeker back to their car. The drive home passed in tense silence, neither of us daring to speak lest we draw unwanted attention. Upon returning to my house, we set up the final ritual in the living room. Salt circles crisscrossed the floor, reinforcing barriers against malevolent forces. Candles burned brightly, casting flickering shadows that danced eerily along the walls. At the center of the circle sat the soul anchor, its presence palpable even beneath layers of fabric. Shadow Seeker handed me a dagger forged from iron and obsidian. "When I give the signal, stab the box," they instructed. "Do not hesitate. Any delay could allow the entity to counteract our efforts." I gripped the hilt tightly, feeling its weight settle into my palm. Despite the fear coursing through me, determination anchored my resolve. For Grandma. For closure. For survival. As Shadow Seeker began chanting in Latin, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air grew colder, frost creeping outward from the soul anchor. Shadows writhed unnaturally, twisting into grotesque forms that loomed closer despite the protective salt. The whispers returned, louder and angrier than before, overlapping in a cacophony of rage. "You dare defy me?" the guttural voice snarled. "You will regret this." Ignoring the taunts, I focused on Shadow Seeker's voice, repeating the incantation alongside them. When they gave the signal, a sharp nod, I plunged the dagger downward with all my strength. The box shattered instantly, releasing a blinding flash of light that engulfed the entire room. A deafening scream reverberated through the space, shaking the very foundation of the house. Then silence. When the light faded, the soul anchor was gone, reduced to ash scattered across the floor. Exhaustion washed over me, pulling me to my knees. Shadow Seeker placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, their expression unreadable beneath the hood. "It's done," they said quietly. "For now." "For now." I echoed, dread pooling in my stomach. "Yes," they admitted grimly. "Destroying the anchor weakens the entity, but it doesn't eliminate it entirely. Be vigilant. It will come for you again." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. The shadows still lingered, watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew they wouldn't rest until they claimed what they believed was theirs. The days following the destruction of the soul anchor brought a fragile sense of calm. Shadows still lingered at the edges of my vision, and the air in certain rooms felt unnervingly cold, but the oppressive weight that had once crushed me seemed lighter. For the first time in weeks, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally broken free. That fragile hope shattered the moment I looked into the mirror. It started innocently enough. I was brushing my teeth late one night, staring absently at my reflection as foam dripped from the corners of my mouth. At first, nothing seemed out of place. My tired eyes met their mirrored counterparts, strands of hair falling messily across my forehead. Normal. Ordinary. Safe. Then something shifted. Behind me in the reflection, Grandma appeared. She wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on something beyond the glass, her expression filled with sorrow. But when I turned around, no one was there. Just empty space and the faint hum of the house settling around me. "Grandma?" I whispered, turning back to the mirror. "Is that you?" Her reflection nodded slightly, raising a translucent hand to point at something behind me. Following her gesture, I glanced over my shoulder again, but still nothing. Frustration bubbled inside me as I faced the mirror once more. Except this time she wasn't alone. Behind her loomed figures cloaked in shadow, the same ones from the nightmares. Their glowing eyes locked onto mine through the glass, radiating malice. Panic surged through me as I stepped backward, knocking the toothbrush from the sink. It clattered loudly against the tiles, breaking the spell. When I looked up again, the mirror showed only my own wide-eyed face, pale and trembling. The room was silent, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. Desperate for answers, I called Shadow Seeker. They didn't pick up immediately, which only heightened my anxiety. By the time they responded, I was pacing the living room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. "It's happening again," I said breathlessly. "The shadows, they're using mirrors now." A heavy sigh came through the line. I feared as much. Mirrors are conduits between worlds. Destroying the soul anchor weakened the entity, but it hasn't given up. It's finding new ways to reach you. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How do I stop it?" "You can't destroy every mirror," they replied grimly, "but you can fortify them. Cover reflective surfaces with cloth or paint them black temporarily. Avoid looking directly into any glass until we figure out its next move." Their advice offered little comfort, but I followed it nonetheless. Every mirror in the house disappeared beneath sheets or layers of dark paint, transforming familiar spaces into eerie, distorted versions of themselves. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by eyes in this world but by forces lurking just beyond sight. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. Instead, I sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the covered mirror in my bedroom. Despite knowing better, curiosity gnawed at me. What would happen if I uncovered it? Would she appear again? Or worse, would they? Against every rational instinct screaming at me to stay away, I reached out and pulled the sheet aside. The surface gleamed innocently under the dim light, reflecting nothing but the faint outline of furniture and walls. Yet as I stared, the image began to change. My reflection blurred, shifting into something unrecognizable. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting into grotesque shapes that resembled hands, reaching, grasping. And then, amid the chaos, Grandma materialized once more. This time, however, she wasn't passive. Her lips moved urgently, forming words I couldn't hear. "What is it?" I whispered, leaning closer despite the warning bells ringing in my mind. Her response came not in speech but in action. With a swift motion, she pressed her palm against the glass. Instantly, frost spread outward, crystallizing the surface. Etched within the icy swirls were 3 chilling words. "It's inside you." Before I could process what she meant, the mirror cracked violently, shards exploding outward like shrapnel. I shielded my face, bracing for impact, but none came. When I lowered my arms, the mirror was intact, its surface smooth and unbroken. And she was gone. Her message haunted me long after the vision faded. "It's inside you." Could the entity have taken root within me during the ritual? Was that why the dreams persisted, why the shadows followed me everywhere? Terrified yet resolute, I resolved to confront whatever force now resided within me. If it wanted a battle, I'd give it one. But first, I needed answers, and weapons stronger than salt and candles. Shadow Seeker was right about one thing. This fight wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, I woke up to an unfamiliar sound, a faint, rhythmic beeping coming from my phone. At first, I thought it was just a notification or an alarm I'd forgotten to turn off. But when I reached for the device, my blood ran cold. There was a voicemail waiting for me. From her grandma. My hands trembled as I tapped the screen, bringing the message to life. Her voice crackled through the speaker, soft yet unmistakable. "Sweetheart, it's me. I don't have much time left." Her tone sent chills down my spine, not because it sounded wrong, but because it carried a finality that made my chest tighten. How could she be calling me? She was gone, or so I'd believed. Yet here she was, speaking as though nothing had changed. "I know you're listening," her voice continued, growing fainter with each word. "I wish I could hold you again." Tears welled up in my eyes as I clutched the phone tightly. "How are you doing this?" I whispered aloud, even though I knew she couldn't hear me. The message ended abruptly, leaving behind only silence. For a moment, I sat there frozen, staring at the screen. Then, driven by a mix of desperation and curiosity, I pressed play again. And again. Each time, her words hit harder, stirring emotions I thought I'd buried long ago. But on the fourth playback something changed. Instead of ending as usual, the recording continued. A new voice emerged, one low, guttural, and dripping with malice. "You cannot escape us." I dropped the phone like it had burned me, scrambling backward until my spine hit the wall. My heart thundered wildly as I stared at the device, half expecting it to burst into flames or sprout legs and crawl toward me. The voice wasn't Grandma's, it belonged to the entity. The same one haunting my dreams, lurking in mirrors and whispering threats in my ear. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the phone and deleted the voicemail immediately. But deep down I knew it wouldn't stop there. Deleting the message wouldn't erase the truth. They were still watching, still waiting. Desperate for guidance, I called Shadow Seeker once more. They answered on the second ring, their tone urgent. "It contacted you directly," they said, skipping pleasantries entirely. "This is escalating faster than anticipated." "What does it mean?" I asked, clutching the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Why is it using her voice?" "To manipulate you," they replied grimly. "It knows your weaknesses, your guilt, your grief, your love for her. By mimicking her, it hopes to lower your defenses." Their explanation made sense, but it offered little comfort. If anything, it made me feel more vulnerable, more exposed. Every memory, every emotion tied to Grandma now felt tainted, weaponized against me. "There's something else," Shadow Seeker added hesitantly. "Voicemails like that, they're not just messages. They're anchors. Anchors designed to tether its influence further into your world, and into you." My stomach churned at the implication. "So what do I do? Smash the phone? Burn it?" "No," they cautioned. "Destroying the device won't sever the connection. You need to confront it head-on. Face the source of the message, not the recording but the intent behind it." That night, armed with protective sigils drawn hastily on scraps of paper and a dagger forged from iron and obsidian, I prepared myself for another ritual. This time, however, the stakes felt higher. The entity wasn't just reaching out, it was breaching barriers, forcing itself into spaces meant to be safe. In the center of my living room, I placed the phone within a salt circle reinforced with herbs and candles. As I lit the wicks, shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that loomed closer despite the protective barrier. Whispering began almost immediately, a cacophony of overlapping voices that grew louder with each passing second. Taking a deep breath, I recited the incantation Shadow Seeker had taught me, my voice trembling but steady. "Vox maligna, discit et non revert eris." Evil voice, depart and do not return. At first nothing happened. Then, slowly the phone vibrated violently, its screen flickering erratically. Static erupted from the speakers, followed by a deafening scream that shook the very foundation of the house. Frost spread outward from the device, crystallizing the surrounding area as the temperature plummeted sharply. Suddenly, the screen illuminated brightly, displaying a single line of text. "You cannot erase what is already written." Before I could react, the phone shattered explosively, shards scattering across the floor. The candles extinguished themselves simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the laughter, a deep, rumbling sound that reverberated through the space like thunder. It mocked me, taunting me with the knowledge that while I'd severed one anchor, countless others remained. When the chaos subsided, I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but alive. The phone was gone, reduced to fragments of glass and metal. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, heavier than ever. Shadow Seeker arrived shortly afterward, their expression grim as they surveyed the damage. "This isn't over," they warned. "If anything, it's only beginning." I nodded, too drained to argue. Deep down, I knew they were right. The entity hadn't been defeated, it had merely retreated, biding its time until it found another way to breach my defenses. And somehow, I doubted I'd survive the next encounter unscathed. The aftermath of the ritual left me physically and emotionally drained, but there was no time to rest. The entity's laughter still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder that it wasn't done with me, or Grandma. Every shadow seemed darker, every whisper louder, every chill sharper. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was building toward a climax, a final confrontation that would decide not just my fate, but hers as well. Shadow Seeker stayed by my side, their presence both comforting and unsettling. They warned me repeatedly that we were running out of options. "Whatever this thing is," they said gravely, "it's ancient, powerful. Destroying its anchors has weakened it, but it won't go quietly. You need to prepare yourself, for everything. For everything? I echoed, dread pooling in my stomach. What does that mean? It means you might have to make sacrifices, they replied cryptically. Choices you won't like. But remember this, love is stronger than fear. Hold on to that no matter what happens. Their words offered little reassurance, but I clung to them like a lifeline. Love had brought me this far. Love for Grandma, for family, even for myself. If I could channel that strength, maybe, just maybe, I stood a chance. 2 nights later, the attacks resumed with renewed ferocity. It started subtly, a flicker of the lights, a distant creak of the floorboards, but quickly escalated into full-blown chaos. Objects flew across rooms without warning, shattering against walls or embedding themselves in furniture. Doors slammed shut on their own, trapping me in spaces where the air grew impossibly cold. Frost spread rapidly, coating surfaces with icy patterns that spelled out ominous messages. You can't protect her. Each incident felt like a taunt, a reminder that I was fighting a losing battle. Yet despite the terror gripping my heart, I refused to give up. Not yet. Not until I'd exhausted every possibility. One particularly harrowing night, the entity manifested fully within my home. Shadows coalesced into grotesque forms, twisting unnaturally as they advanced toward me. Their glowing eyes locked onto mine, radiating pure malice. A guttural voice reverberated through the space, shaking the very foundation of the house. Your grandmother belongs to us. She always has. No. I screamed, clutching the obsidian dagger tightly. She doesn't belong to anyone. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I lunged forward, driving the blade into the nearest shadowy figure. It let out an ear-splitting shriek, dissolving into smoke before reforming moments later. Undeterred, I swung again and again, each strike weakening the creature slightly, but never enough to destroy it completely. As the battle raged on, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. My arms ached, my legs trembled, and my vision blurred from lack of sleep. Just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, a soft voice broke through the chaos. Stop fighting. I froze mid-swing, turning slowly to see Grandma standing in the doorway. She looked radiant, glowing with an ethereal light that pushed back the encroaching darkness. Her expression was calm, almost serene, despite the carnage surrounding her. Grandma, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. How are you here? I'm not truly here, she admitted gently. But I needed to show you something. With a wave of her hand, the shadows retreated, leaving behind only silence. The room brightened slightly, though the oppressive energy remained. Taking a step closer, she reached out, her translucent fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was cold, yet oddly comforting. This isn't about me anymore, she said softly. It's about you. About letting go, not just of me but of the guilt, the fear, the anger. Those emotions are what keep it tethered to this world. I don't know how to let go, I admitted, choking back sobs. Not completely. You do, she insisted. You've already started. Trust yourself. Trust the love we share. That's what will save you and free me. Before I could respond, the shadows surged forward once more, swallowing her whole. The oppressive weight returned instantly, heavier than ever. Desperation clawed at me as I realized I was running out of time. Summoning Shadow Seeker, I explained what Grandma had shown me. Together, we devised a plan. A final ritual designed to sever the entity's connection to both her spirit and mine. It required immense focus, unwavering determination, and a willingness to confront the darkest corners of my soul. We set up the ritual in the attic, the same place where this nightmare had begun. Salt circles crisscrossed the floor, reinforced with protective sigils etched into the wood. Candles burned brightly, casting flickering light across the walls. At the center of the circle sat a small altar adorned with relics of Grandma's life. Photographs, jewelry, and the remnants of the soul anchor we'd destroyed earlier. As midnight approached, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air grew colder, frost spreading outward from the edges of the salt. Shadows writhed unnaturally, twisting into grotesque shapes that loomed closer despite the protective barrier. Whispering filled the space, overlapping voices forming a cacophony of murmurs that made my head spin. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the circle, clutching the obsidian dagger tightly. Shadow Seeker began chanting in Latin, their voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Following their lead, I joined in, repeating the incantation aloud. Spiritus vinculum frangitor, umbri salvanter. Requiescant in pace. Break the spirit's chains, release the shadows. Rest in peace. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the ground beneath us trembled violently. Cracks spread outward from the base of the altar, splitting the earth like jagged veins. Frost erupted along the fissures, crystallizing everything in its path. From the depths emerged figures cloaked in shadow, the same ones I'd faced countless times before. Their glowing eyes locked onto mine with predatory intensity. One of them stepped forward, raising a skeletal hand. Before it could strike, Grandma materialized between us, shielding me with her radiant form. Her voice carried authority, commanding respect even from entities as ancient and malevolent as these. Enough. The shadows hesitated, recoiling slightly as though stung by her presence. Seizing the opportunity, I plunged the dagger into the altar, driving it deep into the remnants of the soul anchor. Light exploded outward, engulfing the entire attic in blinding brilliance. A deafening scream reverberated through the space, shaking the very foundation of the house. Then silence. When the light faded, the shadows were gone. So was Grandma. Exhaustion washed over me, pulling me to my knees. Tears streamed down my face as I stared at the empty space where she'd stood moments ago. Shadow Seeker placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, their expression unreadable beneath the hood. "She's free," they said quietly. "For good this time." Relief flooded through me, mingled with grief and gratitude. Grandma was finally at peace, and so was I. While the scars of this ordeal would never fully heal, I knew I'd emerge stronger because of it. Stronger and wiser. As dawn broke over the horizon, warmth returned to the house for the first time in months. The oppressive energy dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm I hadn't felt since before her death. For the first time in what felt like forever, I slept soundly, unburdened by nightmares or whispers. When I awoke, sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the attic in golden hues. Among the scattered relics lay a single item, her favorite locket, gleaming faintly in the light. Opening it revealed a tiny note written in her familiar handwriting. "Thank you, sweetheart. Always remember, you are stronger than you think." Smiling through tears, I tucked the locket safely away, vowing to honor her memory not with sorrow, but with joy. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I could face them, with love as my guide. And somewhere in a realm beyond ours, I hope she was smiling too.